Julia Mitchell stared at the email on her screen, the cursor blinking as if mocking her indecision. The family reunion was in 3 weeks, and she still hadn't responded to her sister's invitation. 3 years had passed since she'd spoken to most of her relatives, a deliberate distance she maintained like a protective shield. The thought of seeing them again, especially her father, made her stomach knot with anxiety. Outside her apartment window, Seattle's familiar rain tapped against the glass. The gray sky matched her mood as she sipped her cooling coffee. At 34, Julia had built a life that most would envy: a successful career as an environmental lawyer, a cozy apartment in a trendy neighborhood, and friends who respected her independence. What they didn't see was the hollow space where family should have been, a void she'd carefully constructed after that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner in 2020. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother, Matt. "Have you decided about the reunion yet?" Dad's asking. Julia set down her mug with more force than intended, coffee sloshing over the rim. Of course her father was asking through Matt. He hadn't bothered to contact her directly in years. Their relationship had always been complicated, but it was his betrayal that had finally broken their fragile connection. The family business, Mitchell Construction, had been her grandfather's legacy, passed down with the understanding that all 3 siblings would share its management one day. But 2 weeks before that fateful Thanksgiving, she discovered that her father had quietly transferred controlling interest to her older brother, Eric, cutting her and Matt out of meaningful decision-making. Still thinking about it, she texted back to Matt, unwilling to commit. The response came immediately. "Jules, please come. It's time to move past this. Grandma Eleanor isn't getting any younger." The mention of her grandmother, the family matriarch who had always been Julia's fiercest supporter, made her chest ache. Eleanor Mitchell was now 87 and, according to Matt's occasional updates, increasingly frail. The thought of never seeing her grandmother again was the one thing that could pierce Julia's carefully constructed armor. With a sigh, Julia closed her laptop and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The Space Needle stood in the distance, partially obscured by mist. Her life here was safe, predictable. Going home to Vermont meant risking everything she'd built since leaving. The peace, the distance, the illusion of having moved on. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Her sister Rachel's name flashed on the screen. Julia hesitated before answering. "Julia? Are you there?" Rachel's voice sounded tired, strained in a way that was unfamiliar. "I'm here. Just busy with work," Julia lied, watching raindrops chase each other down the window pane. "Look, I know you got the email about the reunion. I'm not calling to pressure you, but there's something you should know." Rachel paused, and Julia could hear her taking a deep breath. "Dad's selling the company." The words hit Julia like a physical blow. "What? To who?" "Northland Developers. They've been eyeing our contracts for years. The deal's almost final." Julia's mind raced. Northland had a notorious reputation for cutting corners on environmental regulations, exactly the kind of company she fought against in her professional life. But what about Eric? "I thought the company was his precious inheritance now." There was another pause. "Eric's in trouble, Jules. The kind that might involve jail time if Dad doesn't bail him out. Embezzlement, fraud, I don't know all the details. Dad's selling to cover it up and pay back what Eric took." The revelation left Julia speechless. Her perfect older brother, her father's golden child, the one who could do no wrong. A criminal? Part of her wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly she felt sick. "The worst part," Rachel continued, filling the silence, "is that it's affecting Grandma Eleanor terribly. She knows something's wrong. Keeps talking about how Grandpa would be devastated to see his life's work sold off. I'm worried about her health." Julia closed her eyes, memories flooding back unbidden. Her grandfather teaching her to read blueprints when she was just 8. Her grandmother insisting that girls could build things just as well as boys could. Family picnics at construction sites, where Julia would proudly wear a too large hard hat, already dreaming of the day she'd help run the company. "I need to think about this, Ratch," she finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There's more," Rachel said, her voice dropping. "Dad's been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. He's not telling anyone yet, but I found his medication. I think that's why he's rushing to solve Eric's problems now, while he still can." The news landed like a sucker punch. Julia sank into her couch, emotions warring inside her. anger at her father's continued favoritism, concern for his health, worry for her grandmother, and an unexpected surge of protective instinct toward the family business she'd once loved so deeply. The reunion is more than just a family gathering now, Rachel added softly. It might be our last chance to save Mitchell Construction. Matt and I can't do it alone. We need you, Jules. You were always the one with the head for business and the spine to stand up to Dad. After hanging up, Julia sat motionless in her apartment as the gray afternoon deepened toward evening. Her carefully constructed life suddenly felt like a hiding place rather than an achievement. She'd run from her family to avoid further hurt, but in doing so, had she abandoned her responsibility to the people who, despite everything, were still her blood? She opened her laptop again and clicked on her sister's email. The cursor hovered over the reply button as memories and fears battled within her. Finally, her fingers began to move across the keyboard. "I'll be there," she wrote simply, then pressed send before she could change her mind. That night, Julia dreamed of Vermont autumn, of maple trees blazing with color, of the old family home with its wraparound porch where her grandmother would serve hot apple cider. She dreamed of blueprints spread across the dining room table, of her grandfather's weathered hands pointing out design features, of her siblings arguing over game night choices. She woke with the taste of childhood nostalgia bittersweet in her mouth, and the certainty that the upcoming reunion would either heal her family's fractures or break them beyond repair. As she packed her suitcase 2 weeks later, Julia tried to prepare herself for what was coming. She'd taken a 2-week leave from her firm, longer than she'd initially planned, but something told her this situation would require more than a weekend to resolve. Her boss had been surprisingly supportive when she'd explained it was a family emergency, perhaps because in 3 years, Julia had never once asked for time off for family reasons. The Mitchell family reunion awaited, and with it, a reckoning long overdue. As her taxi arrived to take her to the airport, Julia took one last look at her apartment, her sanctuary from family drama for so long, and wondered if she would return to it the same person who was leaving now. Vermont in late September was exactly as Julia remembered it. Brilliant foliage painting the mountains in reds and golds, mornings crisp with the promise of winter, afternoons warm enough to pretend summer hadn't quite surrendered. The rental car wound through familiar roads as she approached the town of Mapleton, population 3,852, where 4 generations of Mitchells had lived, worked, and squabbled. The family home appeared around a bend, a sprawling Victorian with green shutters and the same wraparound porch from her dreams. Several cars were already parked in the long driveway, including her father's black Lincoln and Eric's ostentatious red Tesla. Julia's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She wasn't ready for this, but then again, she doubted she ever would be. She parked behind Matt's sensible Subaru and sat for a moment, gathering courage. Her phone chimed with a text from Rachel. "We're in the kitchen." Deep breaths. Julia smiled despite herself. Rachel had always been the peacemaker, the one who held them together even when they were at each other's throats. With a sigh, she grabbed her suitcase and walked up the familiar path to the front door, which opened before she could knock. "You came," Matt said, his lanky frame filling the doorway. At 31, he looked more mature than when she'd last seen him, his sandy hair shorter, his face leaner. He pulled her into a tight hug before she could decide whether to be formal or friendly. "It's good to see you, Jules." The nickname, once annoyingly familiar, now felt like a tenuous connection to a life she'd left behind. She returned the hug stiffly at first, then with genuine warmth as she breathed in the scent of her brother's aftershave mixed with the ever-present smell of coffee that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Where is everyone?" she asked as Matt took her suitcase. "Kitchen." Rachel's stress baking, Eric's pretending everything's normal, and Dad's. Matt lowered his voice, having a rough day with his hands. "Grandma's resting upstairs, but made me promise to wake her when you arrived." Julia nodded, steeling herself as they walked through the familiar hallway with its gallery of family photos. She noticed her college graduation picture was still on the wall, her father standing proudly beside her, before everything fell apart. The sight of it made her chest tighten. The kitchen was warm and chaotic, just as it had always been during family gatherings. Rachel stood at the counter, flour dusting her dark hair, rolling out pie dough with focused determination. Eric sat at the breakfast bar, scrolling through his phone, his once athletic frame now softened by what Julia suspected were too many business lunches and too much stress. And there, seated at the head of the kitchen table, was Robert Mitchell, their father. Julia's first thought was that he looked older, much older than just 3 years should have aged him. His hair had gone completely gray, and the confident posture she remembered had given way to a slight stoop. When he looked up and saw her, something flashed across his face. Relief? Regret? It was gone too quickly for Julia to interpret. "Julia," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "You made it." Before she could respond, Rachel abandoned her pie dough and rushed over, enveloping Julia in a flour-dusted hug. "Thank God you're here," she whispered. "This family is a mess." Eric glanced up from his phone, offering a nod that seemed both acknowledgement and challenge. "Hey, little sister." Still saving the world one lawsuit at a time. The condescension in his tone was familiar, but there was something new beneath it. Fear, perhaps. If what Rachel had told her was true, Eric had good reason to be afraid. "Something like that," Julia replied coolly. "Though I hear you've been busy too. Creative accounting must be time-consuming." The kitchen fell silent. Eric's face hardened, and Robert set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. "Julia," her father warned, "we haven't seen you in years. Let's not start with accusations." "Why not?" Julia countered, the anger she'd suppressed for so long bubbling to the surface. "Since when are we a family that avoids difficult topics?" "Oh wait, we've always been that family, haven't we? Except when it comes to deciding who gets control of the company." Matt placed a restraining hand on her arm. "Jules, please. Grandma's upstairs." The mention of her grandmother cooled Julia's temper slightly. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she'd come. "Fine. We'll play happy family for now. But we need to talk about Northland developers." Eric's head snapped up, his expression briefly panicked before he controlled it. "What about them?" "I know about the sale, Eric. And I know why Dad's selling." She looked directly at her father. "You're bailing him out, aren't you? Just like you've always done." Robert Mitchell's face was a study in contained emotion. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured. "I'm doing what's necessary to protect this family and its legacy." "By selling to environmental criminals?" Julia challenged. "Northland has violated regulations in 3 states. They've paid millions in fines for contaminating groundwater. Is that the legacy you want for Grandpa's company?" "You don't understand business," Eric interjected, his voice tight. "Sometimes fraud isn't a compromise, Eric," Julia shot back. "It's a crime. How much did you embezzle? And from whom? Clients? The company itself?" Eric stood abruptly, his stool scraping against the floor. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Stop it, both of you," Rachel pleaded, flour-covered hands held up like a referee. "This isn't helping." A soft voice from the doorway silenced them all. "Is that my Julia I hear?" Julia turned to see Eleanor Mitchell standing there, smaller than she remembered, her silver hair neatly pinned back, her blue eyes, the same color as Julia's own, still sharp despite her age. The anger drained from Julia instantly, replaced by a rush of love and concern. "Grandma," she said softly, crossing the room to embrace the older woman carefully, as if afraid she might break. Eleanor's hug was surprisingly strong. "You've stayed away too long," she said, her voice carrying the hint of reproach. "But you're here now, and that's what matters." She pulled back to study Julia's face. "You look tired, dear. City life wearing you down." "I'm fine, Grandma," Julia assured her, though in truth, she felt exhausted by just 15 minutes of family interaction. Eleanor patted her cheek. "You never could lie to me convincingly. Come, sit with me in the sunroom. I want to hear about your life while these kitchen magicians finish preparing dinner." It was a graceful exit strategy, and Julia took it gratefully, following her grandmother to the glass-enclosed porch that faced the backyard. They settled into wicker chairs cushioned with faded floral pillows that Julia remembered from childhood. "Now," Eleanor said once they were alone, "tell me what's really happening. And don't spare me the details because of my age. I may be old, but I'm not fragile." Julia smiled despite herself. "You've never been fragile a day in your life, Grandma. And don't you forget it." Eleanor agreed with a nod. "Now talk. Your father thinks I don't know about Eric's troubles or his own health issues. But this house has thin walls, and Robert never could whisper properly." So Julia talked, laying out everything she knew from Rachel's call and her own research into Northland developers. Eleanor listened without interruption, her gnarled hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on the maple tree outside that had stood sentinel over the property for longer than any of them had been alive. "What I don't understand," Julia concluded, "is why Dad always protects Eric, no matter what he does. He handed him the company on a silver platter, and now he's selling it to cover up Eric's crimes. It's not fair, and it's not right." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "Fairness has never been your father's strong suit," she finally said. "But love, flawed as it may be, drives him more than you know. He has a strange way of showing it," Julia muttered. "Not all love is expressed the same way," Eleanor replied. "Robert struggled after your mother left. 3 children to raise alone, a company to run. He made mistakes. Many of them. That's putting it mildly," Julia said, the old hurt rising again. Eleanor reached over to take Julia's hand. "I'm not defending him. I'm just saying that understanding why people do wrong things doesn't make those things right. It just makes forgiveness possible, when and if you're ready." The wisdom in those words settled over Julia like a familiar quilt. This was why she'd missed her grandmother so terribly. Eleanor saw people clearly, but loved them anyway. "The company shouldn't be sold," Julia said firmly. "Not to Northland. Not to anyone. It's Grandpa's legacy, your legacy." Eleanor's eyes crinkled with affection. "And yours, if you want it. You were always the one who understood that Mitchell Construction was about building communities, not just buildings." She squeezed Julia's hand. "The reunion doesn't officially start until tomorrow when the extended family arrives. That gives you tonight to figure out how to save what matters." Dinner that evening was a masterclass in tension. The 5 Mitchells sat around the large oak table that had witnessed decades of family meals, making painful small talk while studiously avoiding any mention of the company, Eric's troubles, or their father's health. Julia pushed her pot roast around her plate, appetite diminished by the weight of unspoken words hanging over them. "Tell us about Seattle," Rachel said, clearly attempting to fill another awkward silence. "Do you like your firm?" Julia seized the neutral topic gratefully. "It's challenging work. We've been focusing on cases against developers who violate environmental regulations." She stopped abruptly, realizing too late she'd stumbled into dangerous territory. Eric's fork clattered against his plate. "Still fighting the good fight against evil corporations, I see. Someone has to," Julia replied evenly, refusing to be baited. Robert cleared his throat. "Julia has always had strong principles. That's admirable, even when inconvenient." The backhanded compliment stung, but before Julia could respond, Matt unexpectedly spoke up. "Actually, Julia's principles might be exactly what this family needs right now." His voice was quiet but firm. "We can't keep pretending everything's fine when we're about to lose the company that's supported 4 generations of Mitchells." Eric's face flushed. "No one's losing anything. The sale is a strategic realignment." "Oh, save the corporate bullshit," Matt cut in with uncharacteristic sharpness. "It's a bailout for your mistakes, and everyone at this table knows it." Eleanor, who had been watching the exchange with keen eyes, set down her water glass. "Matthew's right. I didn't raise my son to run from problems, and he certainly didn't raise his children that way either." She fixed Robert with a pointed look. "At least, that wasn't the intention." The subtle reprimand wasn't lost on anyone. Robert's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wine, and Julia noticed how he steadied his wrist with his other hand, a gesture she now recognized as an attempt to control the early symptoms of Parkinson's. "Mother," Robert began carefully, "some situations require difficult decisions. The company was built by your father's hands," Eleanor interrupted, her voice gentle but unyielding. "He worked alongside his crews, even when he could have stayed in an office. He knew the name of every employee's spouse and children. When the Wilsons couldn't pay their medical bills after little Tommy's accident, your father tore up their invoice and gave Sam Wilson extra shifts. That's the legacy of Mitchell Construction, not numbers on a balance sheet." The table fell silent. Julia glanced at her brothers and sister, seeing the impact of their grandmother's words on each face. Shame on Eric's, resolve on Matt's, hope on Rachel's. "What do you suggest we do?" Robert finally asked, addressing the question to his mother, but looking at Julia. Before Eleanor could answer, the doorbell rang. Rachel frowned, checking her watch. "That's odd. The cousins aren't supposed to arrive until tomorrow." "I'll get it," Matt offered, pushing back from the table. He returned moments later, eyebrows raised in surprise, followed by a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and weathered features that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. "Frank." Robert stood, confusion evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" "Frank Campbell." Julia suddenly recognized him as her father's oldest friend and the construction foreman who had worked for Mitchell Construction since before she was born. "Sorry to interrupt your dinner, Mitch," Frank said, using the nickname only those closest to Robert ever used. "But we need to talk, and it can't wait." His eyes swept the table, lingering briefly on Julia with a nod of recognition before returning to Robert. "It's about the Northland deal." Eric pushed back from the table. "This is a private family matter, Frank." "Not anymore, it isn't," Frank replied evenly. "Not when 78 families depend on Mitchell Construction for their livelihoods." Eleanor stood, her small frame suddenly commanding. "Frank, you're just in time for dessert. Rachel made apple pie. Come sit while I get you a plate." The easy authority in her voice brooked no argument. Frank nodded respectfully, taking the empty chair at the table as Eleanor disappeared into the kitchen, Rachel following to help. "How did you find out about Northland?" Robert asked once they were gone. Frank's weathered face was grim. "Town this size, secrets don't stay secret long. Especially not when Northland surveyors have been taking measurements at the Riverfront project. Word travels fast among the crews." Julia exchanged glances with Matt. The Riverfront project was Mitchell Construction's most prestigious current development, a mixed-use commercial and residential complex along the Connecticut River that had been her grandfather's dream for decades. "So what if they were surveying?" Eric said defensively. "Due diligence is standard in acquisitions." "They weren't just surveying," Frank replied. "They were discussing how to value engineer the project. Their words, not mine. Talking about cheaper materials, cutting corners on the environmental safeguards near the water. Everything your grandfather would have fought against." Eleanor returned with a generous slice of pie and set it before Frank. "Eat," she commanded gently. "Then tell us the rest." Frank took a bite, nodding appreciatively at Rachel, who had followed with coffee. "This is why I've stayed in Vermont all these years. Can't get pie like this anywhere else." The momentary lightness faded as he continued. "The crews are worried, and they have right to be. Northland's got a reputation. They buy local companies, gut the workforce, bring in cheap labor from out of state. Half the men working for Mitchell now will be unemployed by Christmas if this deal goes through." "That's not what they told me," Robert said, his brow furrowed with concern. "And you believe them?" Julia couldn't help interjecting. "Dad, their environmental violations are public record. I've researched them thoroughly. They pay fines as a cost of doing business because it's cheaper than doing things right." Frank nodded in agreement. "The girl knows what she's talking about, Mitch. And there's more. The men took a vote today. If Northland takes over, they walk. All of them." The implications of a mass walkout hung heavy in the air. Mitchell Construction's reputation had always rested on the skill and loyalty of its workforce, many of whom were second- or third-generation employees, sons following fathers into the trade. "They can't do that," Eric protested. "There are contracts, obligations. They can and they will," Frank cut him off. "And good luck finding 78 skilled tradesmen in rural Vermont who are willing to cross that line." Robert's face had gone pale. "I had no idea the situation was this severe." "Because you didn't ask us," Frank said simply. "You didn't ask the people who've helped build this company alongside your family for generations." The rebuke was delivered without anger, but landed with palpable force. Julia watched her father absorb it, noting the slight slump of his shoulders, a rare display of uncertainty from a man who had always projected absolute confidence. "What do the crews propose instead?" Matt asked, leaning forward with interest. Frank took a sip of coffee. "That's why I'm here. They sent me to make you an offer. They want to buy in." "Buy in?" Eric scoffed. "Most of them live paycheck to paycheck." "Some do," Frank acknowledged. "Others have saved. But together, with their union pension funds backing them, they can raise enough to make a competitive counteroffer for a 40% stake. Not controlling interest, but enough to ensure the company stays true to its values." Julia's mind raced with the possibilities. An employee ownership structure? That's actually brilliant. "But it doesn't solve our immediate problem," Eric objected, a note of desperation entering his voice. Rachel, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "What is the immediate problem exactly, Eric? How much trouble are you really in? All eyes turned to Eric, who looked trapped. His gaze darted to their father, seeking rescue. But Robert remained silent, his expression unreadable. It's complicated, Eric finally said. Uncomplicated, Matt suggested coldly. Julia watched her oldest brother's composure crack. For a moment, he looked like the boy who had broken their mother's antique vase and tried to blame the neighbor's cat. Caught and cornered. I made some investments that didn't pan out, Eric admitted reluctantly. Used company funds as collateral. When they failed, I borrowed from client trust accounts to cover the losses. I was going to pay it back. That's not borrowing, Julia said quietly. That's embezzlement. How much? Eric swallowed hard. About 7 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Frank let out a low whistle. Jesus, Eric, Matt breathed. How could you? I was trying to grow the company. Eric's voice rose defensively. Take us to the next level. Become regional, then national. The old business model is dying. Construction is changing, and we were going to be left behind. So you risked everything Grandpa built on some get-rich-quick scheme? Julia couldn't keep the disgust from her voice. It wasn't like that, Eric insisted, but his protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. Robert finally spoke, his voice tired. What's done is done. The Northland deal would cover the shortfall and keep Eric out of prison. At what cost? Julia challenged. The company's soul? The livelihoods of 78 families? Your own father's legacy. Frank cleared his throat. There might be another way. If the employee buy-in provides enough capital to cover some of the shortfall, and if, he looked pointedly at Julia, someone with legal expertise could negotiate with the affected clients, perhaps arrange partial payments or settlements. Julia felt all eyes turn to her. You want me to clean up Eric's mess? Legally. No one else at this table has your skills, Matt pointed out. Or your principles, Eleanor added. Softly from the doorway, where she had been listening, Julia looked around the table, at Frank's steady gaze, Matt's hopeful expression, Rachel's pleading eyes, her grandmother's quiet confidence. At her father, whose hands now trembled visibly, a man facing not just his son's failures, but his own mortality. And finally at Eric, her antagonist since childhood, now looking at her not with his usual condescension, but with something she'd never seen from him before, humility. I need to see all the financials, Julia said slowly. Every account, every client affected. Total transparency. You'll have it, Robert promised. And decision-making authority on the legal strategy, she continued, warming to the possibility despite herself. Agreed, her father nodded. And one more thing, Julia added, her gaze locking with Eric's. This company needs new leadership. Not you, not me, not Dad. Then who? Eric asked, a mixture of relief and resignation in his voice. Julia looked at Matt, who had always been the quiet one, the peacemaker, the one who stayed when she and Eric had left, the one who knew every employee by name, just as their grandfather had. I think we already know the answer to that, she said softly. Matt's eyes widened in surprise. Me? But you're just the heart of this family, Eleanor finished for him, moving to place a hand on his shoulder. And Mitchell Construction has always been built on heart. As the implications of what they were considering settled over the room, Julia felt something shift inside her, the first tentative mending of a break that had seemed irreparable just hours ago. They were still far from solutions, farther still from healing the wounds that had driven them apart. But for the first time in years, they were facing their problems as a family, uncomfortable truths and all. Outside the dining room window, darkness had fallen completely, but Julia could still make out the silhouette of the maple tree, strong, rooted, enduring, like the best parts of what they could be, if they chose to try. Morning light filtered through the blinds of her grandfather's old office as Julia spread financial documents across the mahogany desk. She'd been at it since dawn, fueled by black coffee and determination. The company ledgers, client accounts, and bank statements told a story far worse than she'd imagined. You look like Dad when you concentrate like that, Matt said from the doorway, holding 2 fresh mugs of coffee. He handed one to Julia and settled into the leather chair across from her. Is that supposed to be a compliment? Julia asked, arching an eyebrow as she accepted the coffee gratefully. Matt smiled. Take it however you want. But Grandpa used to say the same thing about Dad, back when Dad was fighting to save the company during the recession of '08. The comparison gave Julia pause. She'd never considered that her father might have faced similar challenges, might have made difficult decisions to protect what his father had built. How bad is it? Matt asked, nodding toward the papers. Julia rubbed her temples. Worse than Eric admitted. It's not just 7 million. It's closer to 10 when you factor in the interest owed and the contracts he signed with impossible delivery terms. Jesus, Matt whispered. Can we survive this? Julia hesitated. Legally? Maybe. Financially? I don't know yet. The door opened again, and Rachel entered carrying a tray of muffins. Breakfast meeting in session? She asked, setting down the tray. I figured you'd both forgotten to eat again. The smell of fresh blueberry muffins reminded Julia that she hadn't had dinner the night before, having excused herself after the revelations to start going through the company records. She took one gratefully. Has Dad been up? Julia asked between bites. Rachel nodded. He's with Grandma Eleanor. She insisted on showing him old photo albums. I think it's her way of reminding him what's at stake. The siblings fell into a comfortable silence that would have been unimaginable just 24 hours earlier. It felt strangely like old times, when they would gather in this office to do homework while their father worked, before their mother left, before the business became a wedge between them. Where's Eric? Julia finally asked. Still sleeping. Rachel replied with a note of disapproval. Or hiding. Take your pick. Has he always been this irresponsible? Or did I just miss it because I was so fixated on Dad's favoritism? Julia wondered aloud. Matt and Rachel exchanged glances. Both. They said simultaneously, then laughed at the coincidence. Eric's always been good at making Dad believe in him, Matt explained. He talks a good game about vision and expansion. Dad ate it up because it sounded like progress. Meanwhile, Rachel added, Matt's been the one actually running day-to-day operations for the past 2 years, ever since Dad started having health issues. Julia looked at her younger brother with newfound respect. Why didn't you tell me? Matt shrugged. You were building your own life. And honestly, I didn't want to give you another reason to be angry with Dad. The protective instinct in his voice touched Julia deeply. Matt had always been the family peacemaker, shouldering burdens silently rather than causing conflict. I need to understand something, Julia said, closing the folder in front of her. Why didn't either of you stop Eric when you saw what was happening? Rachel sank into a chair. We didn't know until it was too late. Eric compartmentalized everything. Kept the trust accounts separate from the operating finances Matt oversaw. And Dad trusted him completely, Matt added. When I raised concerns about cash flow issues, Eric always had explanations that Dad accepted without question. Julia nodded, picturing how easily their charismatic older brother could spin a convincing narrative. And when did you finally figure it out? 3 weeks ago, Matt said grimly. One of the clients called asking why their escrow payment had been moved without authorization. I started digging and found, well, everything. That's when we confronted Dad, Rachel continued. He already knew. Eric had come clean to him the day before when he couldn't cover an urgent payment. Julia's jaw tightened, and Dad's first instinct was to sell to Northland rather than hold Eric accountable. He's trying to protect all of us, a voice said from the doorway. Their father stood there, looking older in the morning light, a slight tremor visible in his right hand. Not just Eric. The siblings fell silent as Robert Mitchell entered the room that had once been his domain. He moved slowly, deliberately, compensating for the symptoms he could no longer fully hide. $10 million of client money doesn't disappear without serious consequences, he continued, easing himself into a chair. If this becomes public, we're looking at criminal charges, civil suits, and the company's reputation destroyed overnight. Every Mitchell would bear that stain. So your solution is to sell Grandpa's legacy to criminals who'll destroy it in a different way? Julia challenged. Robert's eyes flashed with a hint of his old fire. My solution was to protect my family the only way I could see how. If you have a better idea, Julia, I'm all ears. That's why you're here, isn't it? The directness of the question caught Julia off guard. For years, she'd imagined confronting her father, making him acknowledge the unfairness of his choices. Now, faced with his vulnerability and genuine request for her help, her rehearsed recriminations felt hollow. Frank's proposal has potential, she said after a moment. If the employees buy in, and if we can negotiate settlements with the affected clients, we might avoid criminal charges and keep the company independent. And where would the money for settlements come from? Robert asked. Even with employee investment, we'd be millions short. This was the question Julia had been wrestling with all night. We have assets we could leverage. The equipment fleet, the Westfield property, the timber rights on the North acreage. Those are essential to operations, her father objected. Not all of them, Matt interjected. Dad, we've been carrying overhead we don't need because it's how we've always done things. The Westfield property has been sitting empty for 5 years, and we lease half our equipment already. Robert looked surprised at Matt's assessment, perhaps realizing for the first time how much his youngest son understood about the business. The office door opened again, and Eric appeared, looking haggard and unrest. His eyes widened slightly at finding the entire family assembled. Family meeting without me? He asked, attempting levity that fell flat in the tense atmosphere. Perfect timing, Julia said coolly. We were just discussing how to clean up your mess without selling to Northland. Eric's face hardened. There is no other way. I've explored every option. Have you? Julia challenged. Or was Northland's offer just the easiest solution that kept you out of prison? That's enough, Robert interjected. Accusations won't solve anything. Neither will pretending this isn't Eric's fault, Julia shot back. To everyone's surprise, Eric didn't argue. He sank into the remaining chair, looking defeated. She's right. This is my fault, all of it. I thought I could make us bigger, more successful. Every investment seemed guaranteed, until suddenly nothing was working. I kept digging the hole deeper, thinking the next deal would save us. The raw admission hung in the air. Julia had expected denials, excuses, the usual deflection she'd come to associate with her older brother. His acceptance of responsibility was disarming. Why didn't you come to us sooner? Rachel asked softly. Eric's laugh was bitter. And admit I'd failed? That the golden child had screwed up so badly he might go to prison? I couldn't face Dad with that. So instead you let it get so bad that the entire company is at risk, Julia said, but the heat had gone from her voice. I'm sorry, Eric said simply, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. Robert cleared his throat. What matters now is finding a solution. Julia, if you believe there's an alternative to the Northland deal, I want to hear it. All of it. Julia glanced at her siblings, finding encouragement in their eyes, even Eric's. She took a deep breath and outlined what she'd been formulating through the night. A complex plan involving employee ownership, asset restructuring, client settlements, and a complete reorganization of company leadership. It would mean significant changes, she concluded, and sacrifices from everyone in this room. What kind of sacrifices? Her father asked warily. Eric would have to step down completely, Julia began, and potentially face some legal consequences, though we could likely negotiate probation rather than prison time if we make substantial restitution. Eric nodded, unsurprising given the alternatives. Matt would become CEO, with a board including employee representatives. Matt looked startled despite the previous night's conversation. Julia, I don't know if I'm ready for that. You've been running things anyway, Rachel pointed out. This just makes it official. And Dad, Julia continued, meeting her father's eyes directly. You would need to transfer your remaining ownership to a family trust, with Grandma Eleanor as the trustee initially. Robert's expression tightened. You're asking me to give up control of my company? I'm asking you to secure its future, Julia corrected gently. With your health concerns, yes, we all know about the Parkinson's. This protects both you and the company. You'd still be chairman emeritus, and your experience would be invaluable. For a long moment, Robert Mitchell sat in silence, his eyes moving from child to child. Julia could almost see him wrestling with pride, tradition, and the realization that his carefully constructed world was changing whether he embraced it or not. And what would your role be in this new arrangement? He finally asked Julia. She hesitated. I'd handle the legal restructuring and settlements, then return to Seattle. My life is there now. Is it? Her grandmother's voice came from the doorway, where she stood with Frank Campbell beside her. Or is that just where you've been hiding, Julia? Before Julia could respond, the doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the first extended family members for the reunion. Reality crashed back in. They had house guests arriving, a weekend of festivities planned, all while their immediate family teetered on the brink of its greatest crisis. Perfect timing, Rachel sighed, standing. The Evans cousins are always early. Go. Eleanor commanded with the authority of a general. All of you, be good hosts. Frank and I will show the first arrivals to their rooms. This discussion isn't finished, but family obligations come first. As they filed out of the office, Julia felt her father's hand on her arm, holding her back while the others continued down the hall. You've thought of everything, haven't you? He said quietly when they were alone. Just like your grandfather would have. The comparison, so similar to what Matt had said earlier, struck a chord in Julia. I learned from watching you, before things went wrong between us. Robert's eyes softened with an emotion Julia couldn't quite name. Perhaps we both have more to learn from each other than I realized. He gestured to the door. Shall we go greet the family? I believe your cousin Grace is especially eager to see you. She's considering law school now. They walked together toward the sounds of arriving relatives, the weight of their conversation still hanging between them, but somehow lighter than before, as if naming their problems had already begun the process of solving them. By mid-afternoon, the Mitchell house buzzed with activity. Relatives from across New England had descended for the annual reunion, filling the rooms with laughter, gossip, and the inevitable family politics. Julia moved through conversations with practiced ease, deflecting questions about her long absence with vague references to her demanding career. All the while, her mind remained fixed on the morning's discussions and the mountain of work that awaited once the social obligations ended. You're a million miles away, observed her cousin Grace, a bright-eyed college senior who had attached herself to Julia's side since arriving. Is it weird being back after so long? They stood on the back porch, watching younger cousins play an impromptu game of touch football on the sprawling lawn. The maple trees that bordered the property blazed orange and red in the autumn sunlight. Weird doesn't begin to cover it, Julia admitted. How's Princeton treating you? It's challenging, but I love it. I'm still set on law school after graduation. Grace lowered her voice. Environmental law, actually. Your career path inspired me. Julia felt an unexpected warmth at her cousin's words. Really? I had no idea. Mom says you're the only Mitchell who ever escaped the gravitational pull of the family business, Grace continued with a grin. Though she didn't mean it as a compliment. Julia laughed despite herself. Aunt Vivian, her father's sister, had always been vocal about family loyalty. And what do you think? Is escaping a good thing? Grace considered this, twisting her class ring thoughtfully. I think finding your own path is important. But so is remembering where you came from. She nodded toward the football game, where Matt was now being tackled by 3 young cousins simultaneously. Some roots are worth keeping, you know? Before Julia could respond, Rachel appeared at the screen door. Julia, can you help in the kitchen? Aunt Helen is trying to reorganize Grandma's entire spice cabinet, and we need reinforcements. Julia excused herself, grateful for the interruption. Grace's innocent observations had hit too close to the conflict she'd been battling since arriving. The tension between independence and belonging, between forging her own identity and honoring her family history. The kitchen was chaotic in the way only a Mitchell family gathering could be. Aunt Helen, their father's other sister, was indeed rearranging spices while debating menu options with Rachel and 2 female cousins. Eleanor sat at the breakfast bar, shelling peas and observing the commotion with amused tolerance. Julia, tell your aunt that alphabetizing spices is ridiculous. Eleanor called over the noise. They should be organized by frequency of use, as God intended. Don't drag me into this, Julia laughed, picking up a knife to help chop vegetables. I live alone and order takeout 4 nights a week. Shameful, Helen declared, but her eyes twinkled with affection. No wonder you're so thin. We'll fatten you up this weekend. The familiar rhythm of kitchen work soothed Julia. This had always been her favorite part of family gatherings. The women of various generations working side by side, sharing news and gentle gossip, while preparing food that would bring everyone together. For all the Mitchell family's flaws and fractures, there was something solid and real in these traditions. I hear Eric's wife isn't coming this year, Aunt Helen said casually, though her tone conveyed nothing casual about the observation. Rachel exchanged a quick glance with Julia. Melissa had a work commitment she couldn't break, she replied smoothly. The truth, that Eric's marriage was strained to breaking point by his financial misdeeds, wasn't for sharing. Helen responded, clearly unconvinced. And Robert seems different. Is everything all right with him? Your brother is getting older, Helen, Eleanor interjected firmly. As are we all. Now, who's checking the turkey? The deft change of subject was pure Eleanor Mitchell, gentle but unmistakable in its purpose. Julia caught her grandmother's eye and received a subtle wink in return. Eleanor had always been the family's guardian, protecting each member's dignity while keeping peace between strong personalities. Later, as relatives gathered around the extended dining table for the traditional Friday night pre-reunion dinner, Julia found herself seated between her father and Uncle James, her mother's brother, who had remained close to the Mitchells even after the divorce. The unexpected placement wasn't coincidental. Eleanor's handiwork again, no doubt. "Good to see you, Jules," James said warmly, squeezing her shoulder. "Your mom asked me to give you her love." The mention of her mother sent a familiar pang through Julia. Catherine Mitchell, now Catherine Lawson, had rebuilt her life in Arizona, remarrying 5 years after leaving Vermont and Robert. The geographic and emotional distance had strained Julia's relationship with her mother, though they maintained regular phone calls. "How is she?" Julia asked, genuinely curious. "Happy. Busy with her gallery. She's planning to visit Boston next month and hoped you might meet her there." Julia nodded, conscious of her father stiffening slightly beside her. "I'd like that. She'd be proud of what you're doing here," James added quietly, so only Julia could hear. At her startled look, he smiled. "Small towns, remember? I had coffee with Frank Campbell this morning. He mentioned you might be the family's saving grace." Before Julia could process this, Eleanor tapped her glass for attention. The table gradually quieted, all eyes turning to the family matriarch at the head of the table. "Before we eat," Eleanor began, her voice still strong despite her years, "I want to welcome everyone to another Mitchell family reunion. Some of you have traveled far to be here." Her gaze lingered briefly on Julia. "Others have journeyed in different ways. But together, we represent 4 generations of a family that has weathered storms, celebrated joys, and built not just structures, but community." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Eleanor continued, her blue eyes bright with purpose. "Mitchell Construction turns 80 years old this year. My herald started with nothing but his hands and his dreams after returning from war. Today, that dream employs dozens of families and has built half the structures in this county." She paused, her gaze sweeping the table. "Every family business faces challenges across generations. Ours is no different. But what defines us is not the challenges we face, but how we face them, together, with integrity, and with an eye to the future." Julia felt a chill at her grandmother's words, wondering how much Eleanor intended to reveal. Beside her, her father's breathing had become measured, controlled. Across the table, Eric stared fixedly at his water glass. "This weekend," Eleanor concluded, "as we celebrate our family bonds, I ask each of you to remember what the Mitchell name stands for in this community, and to consider what part you might play in ensuring that legacy continues for generations to come." With that cryptic statement, she raised her glass. "To family. To family." Everyone echoed, though Julia noticed puzzled glances exchanged among the extended relatives. Eleanor had essentially announced that the company faced difficulties without specifying what they were. It was a masterful move, preparing the ground without causing panic. As dinner progressed, Julia found herself drawn into conversation with Uncle James about her environmental law cases. Her father listened silently beside her, occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions about regulatory frameworks and compliance strategies. It was the most civil conversation they'd shared in years, conducted awkwardly through a third party, but genuine nonetheless. "You know," Robert said during a lull, "your approach to the Riverdale wetlands case reminds me of how your grandfather handled the town council back in '75 when they tried to rezone the north end for industrial use." Julia turned to him, surprised. "I didn't know about that." He believed development and conservation could coexist with proper planning, Robert continued. "Fought like hell for buffer zones and water protections that weren't even required back then. Said a builder who didn't respect the land wasn't worthy of changing it." The comment revealed a side of her grandfather and her father's understanding of him that Julia had never considered. "Is that why the company has always exceeded environmental requirements?" "I thought that was your policy." "It was his first," Robert acknowledged. "I just continued it, even when it wasn't always the cheapest approach." Julia digested this, reconsidering some of her assumptions about her father's business values. Perhaps the gulf between them wasn't quite as wide as she'd believed. After dinner, as relatives dispersed to various corners of the house and yard, Julia found herself cornered by Aunt Vivian, Grace's mother and the family's most forthright member. "So," Vivian said without preamble, "are you finally going to tell us what's really happening with the company?" Mother's speech wasn't exactly subtle. Julia hesitated. "What makes you think something's happening?" "Please," Vivian rolled her eyes. "Robert looks like he's carrying the weight of the world. Eric is drinking too much and avoiding eye contact. And you're back after 3 years of self-imposed exile. It doesn't take a genius." Julia considered her options. The crisis was still family business, but a larger circle of family than just their immediate household. Before she could decide how to respond, she spotted Matt waving urgently from the hallway. "Excuse me," she told Vivian. "We'll talk later." Matt pulled her into the relative quiet of the front parlor, where Frank Campbell waited with a grim expression. "What's wrong?" Julia asked immediately. "Northland's making moves," Frank explained without preamble. "They've called an emergency meeting with your father for tomorrow morning. Their CEO flew in personally." Julia's heart sank. "They must have gotten wind of our alternative plan." "Almost certainly," Frank agreed. "Small town, remember? And they've got too much at stake to let this deal slip away easily." "Have you told Dad?" Julia asked Matt. "Not yet. He's with the Johnson cousins, telling stories about their grandfather. I didn't want to interrupt in front of everyone." Julia nodded. "Smart. Let him have this evening at least." She turned to Frank. "How solid is the employee buy-in?" "If we need to move quickly, rock solid," Frank replied. "The meeting's set for Sunday morning. Everyone's contributed what they can. The union pension fund administrators are prepared to move forward assuming the legal framework is sound." "And the bank?" Matt added. "Any movement on the loan restructuring?" Frank's expression brightened slightly. "Better than expected. Tom Williams at First Vermont is cautiously open to your proposal. Having Mitchell as an employee-owned entity actually reduces certain risk factors from their perspective." Julia felt a surge of cautious optimism. The pieces were falling into place, but Northland's accelerated timeline threatened everything. "We need to be ready for their meeting tomorrow. Matt, can you pull together the current project valuations for all active sites? I want to know exactly what they're after beyond just the company name." Matt nodded. "I'll have it by morning." "And Frank," Julia continued, "can you get me confidential statements from 5 or 6 of your most senior crew members? Personal testimonials about what the company means to them, their history with it? Emotional leverage might matter as much as financial arguments." "Consider it done," Frank said. "These men have worked for Mitchells their entire lives. Their fathers before them too. Their stories will be powerful." A throat cleared from the doorway. They turned to find Robert standing there, his expression unreadable. "Planning a coup?" he asked mildly. Julia tensed, unsure how much he'd heard or how he would react to their strategizing without him. "Planning to save your company," Frank replied bluntly. "Because Northland's coming in hot, Mitch." Tomorrow morning. Robert entered the room fully, closing the door behind him. The family noise from the rest of the house became a muffled backdrop. "I know. Their CEO called me directly while I was showing Uncle Peter the new tractor." "And?" Julia prompted when he didn't continue. Robert sank into an armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 65 years. "And he implied that if the deal falls through, they'll ensure Mitchell Construction never bids successfully on another major project in New England. They have the connections to back up that threat." The implications hung heavy in the air. Beyond the current crisis, Northland could potentially destroy them through market manipulation and industry relationships. "So we full?" Matt asked, disbelief in his voice. "After everything we've put together?" "No," Robert said firmly, surprising them all. "We fight. I just wanted you to understand the stakes." He looked at Julia directly. "All of you." Julia met her father's gaze, seeing in it not the controlling patriarch she'd resented for years, but a man trying to protect what he valued while facing his own mortality. It was a humbling realization. "We'll be ready," she assured him. Together. For the first time since her arrival, Julia felt the fractured pieces of her family identity beginning to realign, not into their old configuration, but something new, something that might bridge the divides of the past while charting a different future. Outside the parlor window, the maple tree's shadow stretched long across the lawn as the day's light faded. Yet inside, Something vital and necessary was finally emerging from shadow into clarity. Saturday morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn day that Vermont postcards were made of. Julia sat in her father's sedan, briefcase on her lap, watching the sun illuminate the town's church steeple as they drove toward the Mapleton Inn where Northland's executives waited. Neither she nor her father had spoken much during the drive, both lost in preparation for the confrontation ahead. "You know," Robert finally said as they neared the town square, "I've been in business for 40 years, but I've never walked into a meeting with my daughter as my legal counsel." Julia glanced at him, surprised by the hint of pride in his voice. Having second thoughts? Not at all. He navigated the car into the inn's parking lot with deliberate care, compensating for the slight tremor in his hands. "Just wishing it hadn't taken a crisis for us to work together." The simple honesty of the statement caught Julia off guard. "Me too," she admitted quietly. In the lobby, they were directed to the inn's conference room where Charles Blackwood, Northland's CEO, waited with two executives and their legal counsel. Introductions were brief, the atmosphere tense with unspoken agendas. "Robert," Blackwood began once they were seated, "I appreciate you meeting on such short notice. But I'm confused why you brought your daughter rather than Eric, given the negotiations we've already conducted." "My daughter is a partner at Westlake Environmental Law in Seattle," Robert replied evenly. "She's here as both family and counsel." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I see. Well, I'll be direct. We've heard rumors that you're exploring alternative arrangements for Mitchell Construction. I'm here to remind you that we have a letter of intent with specific non-solicitation clauses." "A non-binding letter of intent," Julia corrected, opening her briefcase, "which explicitly allows for continued operation and good faith exploration of alternatives until final contracts are signed." Blackwood's attorney, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, leaned forward. "The intent was clear, Ms. Mitchell. Your family agreed to sell to Northland. Resources have been deployed based on that understanding." "Intent isn't the same as obligation," Julia replied calmly, "especially when the full financial situation wasn't disclosed during initial discussions." "Meaning?" Blackwood asked, his tone hardening. Julia met his gaze directly. "Meaning my family has decided to pursue an employee stock ownership plan instead of an outside sale. The structural framework is in place, the financing is arranged, and the transition plan has been approved by key stakeholders." Blackwood's laugh was dismissive. "Construction workers buying a company this size? That's not just unlikely, Ms. Mitchell, it's impossible. Not when combined with family trust restructuring, bank refinancing, and union pension fund investment," Julia countered, sliding a document across the table. "The numbers work, Mr. Blackwood. I've spent the last 3 days making sure of it." The Northland executives exchanged glances as their attorney quickly skimmed the document Julia had provided, a high-level summary of the alternative proposal, carefully drafted to reveal their serious intent without disclosing confidential details. "This doesn't address the underlying issue," Blackwood said finally. "The company has significant liabilities that aren't on these spreadsheets." He was referring to Eric's embezzlement, though couching it in vague terms. Julia had anticipated this approach. "If you mean the misappropriated client trust funds, we've developed a restitution plan that satisfies the affected parties," she replied. "The documents were finalized last night, with signed acceptance from 70% of impacted clients already." This wasn't entirely true. They had framework agreements, but not final signatures. But Julia had learned that in negotiations, projected certainty often created its own reality. The slight widening of the lawyer's eyes told her the bluff had landed. "Let's be realistic." Blackwood tried again, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone as he addressed Robert directly. "Your son faces potential criminal charges. We're offering a clean exit that protects the Mitchell name. This alternative leaves you vulnerable both legally and financially." Robert had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now he straightened in his chair. "My son made serious mistakes," he acknowledged, his voice steady despite the personal pain the admission must have caused. "But selling my father's company to protect him from consequences isn't the right answer. It never was." Julia felt a surge of respect for her father. The admission couldn't have been easy. "You're making a grave mistake," Blackwood warned, his friendly facade evaporating. "We have relationships with every major developer in New England. Crosspoint Contracting is particularly interested in your riverfront project contracts, which they could easily absorb if your company faced difficulties. The implied threat hung in the air. Crosspoint was Northland's subsidiary, notorious for aggressive tactics. Threatening anti-competitive practices isn't a particularly sound negotiating strategy, Julia observed mildly. Especially not when recorded. Blackwood froze. What? Julia tapped her phone on the table. Vermont is a one-party consent state for recordings, Mr. Blackwood. The state attorney general, who happens to be my law school classmate, takes a special interest in protecting local businesses from predatory practices. It was another calculated bluff. Julia hadn't actually called the attorney general, though she certainly could. The implied connection, however, shifted the power dynamic instantly. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. This is unprofessional. No, Julia corrected, gathering her papers. What's unprofessional is attempting to leverage a family crisis to acquire a company below market value, then threatening market collusion when refused. She stood, her father following suit. Our attorney will send formal notification that we're withdrawing from acquisition discussions. We wish Northland success in its other ventures, preferably ones that don't involve Mitchell Construction. Outside in the parking lot, Robert let out a long breath. That was impressive and terrifying, Julia admitted, the confident facade dropping now that they were alone. Blackwood isn't going to take this well. No, Robert agreed. But you gave us breathing room. Time to make the employee ownership plan real instead of just a negotiating strategy. They drove back toward the house in thoughtful silence. The family reunion activities were in full swing. A barbecue lunch was planned, followed by the traditional Mitchell family softball game. Personal and professional obligations pulled in opposite directions. I need to call the bank, Julia said as they turned onto the familiar road leading home, and finished drafting the client settlement agreements. Robert nodded, then unexpectedly pulled the car to the side of the road, parking beneath a towering maple ablaze with red leaves. The work will wait an hour, he said simply. There's something I need to show you first. Curious, Julia followed him as he walked stiffly up a small hillside path she'd never noticed before, despite growing up in this town. The path wound through sugar maples and white birch, climbing gently until it opened into a small clearing with a breathtaking view of the valley below. The town of Mapleton spread out beneath them, the Connecticut River winding silver through farmlands and forests touched with autumn fire. I've never been here, Julia said, taking in the vista. Your grandfather brought me here when I was about your age, Robert replied, his voice softened by memory. It was when I was ready to leave Mapleton, convinced there were bigger things waiting for me in Boston or New York. He didn't try to stop me. He just showed me this view. Julia turned to her father, seeing not the hard-driving businessman she'd resented, but a man trying to connect across the divide between them. What did he say? Nothing at first. We just stood here, looking out at what his hands had helped build. Then he told me something I've never forgotten. Robert's voice grew rough with emotion. He said, "Roots don't hold you back, son. They give you strength to grow tall." The simplicity of the wisdom struck Julia deeply, echoing Grace's words from the day before. Her eyes burned suddenly with unexpected tears. I've made mistakes, Julia, her father continued quietly. With the company, with your brother, with you. I was so focused on preserving what my father built that I forgot why he built it. Not just for himself, or even for me, but for this community, these people. He gestured toward the town below. And most of all, for his family to share, not to fight over. Julia stood silent, absorbing the rare vulnerability from a man who had always seemed impenetrable to her. I thought keeping control was the only way to protect his legacy, Robert admitted. I was wrong. You and Matt and Rachel, even Eric in his misguided way, you're the real legacy. The company is just the tool that connects us to each other and to this place. The understanding that had been building in Julia since her arrival crystallized in that moment. That her father, for all his faults, had been acting from love, however imperfectly expressed. And that her own leaving had been both a necessary separation and a kind of abandonment of something precious. I don't know if I can move back, she said honestly. I've built a life in Seattle. I'm not asking you to, Robert replied. Mitchell Construction needs your legal mind and your principles right now, not your permanent residence. Though, he added with the ghost of a smile, your grandmother would certainly prefer having you closer. Julia laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. She's not subtle about it. Never has been, Robert agreed. They stood in companionable silence for a moment longer before he spoke again. We should get back. They'll be looking for us. As they walked down the path, Julia found herself saying what she'd thought impossible just days ago. I could come back more often. Take the lead on restructuring the company legally. Work remotely part-time during the transition. Matt would appreciate that, Robert said, though his eyes revealed how much the offer meant to him as well. He's ready to lead, but he'll need support. And Eric? Julia asked, the question that had been troubling her since discovering the extent of her brother's actions. Robert sighed heavily. He'll face consequences, legal and personal. But he's still family. We don't abandon family, even when they falter. It was the philosophy Julia had once rejected as enabling favoritism. Now, she heard it differently. Not as blind loyalty, but as committed love, the kind that holds accountable while refusing to discard. They arrived back at the house to find the reunion in full swing. Cousins played horseshoes in the side yard. Aunts and uncles clustered on the porch, swapping stories and memories. Matt was at the grill, expertly flipping burgers while debating baseball statistics with Uncle James. And in the center of it all, Eleanor Mitchell sat in her favorite wicker chair, supervising everything with benevolent authority. There you are, she called when she spotted Julia and Robert. Come tell everyone about sending that Northland vulture packing. Frank just called Rachel with the news. It's all over town already. Julia laughed, not surprised that their private business meeting had become public knowledge so quickly. Small towns, she murmured to her father, who nodded with rueful acceptance. As they joined the gathering, Julia found herself pulled into the embrace of family with an ease that would have seemed impossible days ago. Rachel handed her a lemonade, whispering, "Well done, counselor," before being called away to referee a dispute between younger cousins. Eric approached cautiously, asking for a private word later about next steps, a humility in his demeanor that suggested genuine change might be possible. Matt gave her a grateful nod from the grill, his quiet confidence a reminder of the strength that had been developing in her absence. The afternoon unfolded in a blend of family tradition and new possibilities. During the softball game, Julia found herself playing alongside her father for the first time in years, their competitive instincts momentarily aligned instead of opposed. When Grace hit a line drive that scored the winning run, the entire Mitchell clan erupted in cheers, momentarily united beyond their usual factions and frictions. Later, as twilight settled over the property, Eleanor gathered everyone on the sprawling porch for the traditional family photo. Julia stood beside her father, Matt and Rachel flanking them, Eric slightly apart but still included in the frame. Behind them, the extended Mitchell family created a tapestry of connection, imperfect, complicated, but enduring. Smile, the photographer instructed, but Julia already was, filled with something that felt surprisingly like homecoming. That night, after most relatives had retired to guest rooms or departed for local accommodations, the core family gathered once more in the kitchen. Frank Campbell joined them, along with 2 senior employees who would serve on the new company board. Around the table, they finalized the framework that would transform Mitchell Construction into an employee-owned enterprise with family stewardship. It won't be easy, Julia cautioned as they reviewed the documents. The transition will take time. The debt will be substantial for a few years, and we'll need to win back some trust in the community once the situation becomes more widely known. We'll manage, Matt said with quiet confidence. We're Mitchells, and Mitchells build things that last. Eleanor added from her place at the head of the table, including second chances. Her words seemed directed particularly at Eric, who sat subdued but engaged at the far end. He nodded slightly, accepting both the rebuke and the grace it contained. As midnight approached, only Julia and her grandmother remained in the kitchen, sharing a final cup of tea before bed. The house had settled into peaceful quiet, the crisis not fully resolved but contained, the path forward illuminated if not yet fully traveled. You did good work here, Eleanor said, patting Julia's hand. Not just the legal maneuvering, though that was impressive. The harder work. She tapped her chest over her heart. I had a good teacher, Julia replied. Several, actually. Eleanor smiled. Family teaches us our hardest lessons. but it also gives us the strength to learn them. She rose slowly, her age showing in the careful movement. Will you be staying after the reunion ends? For a while, Julia said. There's still so much to do with the restructuring. And then, we'll see. Her grandmother nodded, satisfied. That's all I ask. That you see what's possible here before you decide. She kissed Julia's forehead before heading toward the stairs. Good night, my dear. Tomorrow's another day for building. Left alone in the kitchen, Julia moved to the window that overlooked the backyard. The old maple tree stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, its branches reaching upward while its roots held firm in the Vermont soil. Like family, she thought, extending outward into the world while remaining connected to what nourished it. She would return to Seattle eventually. Her career, friends, and independent life still mattered. But something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of where she belonged and what belonged to her. The Mitchell legacy wasn't just buildings or business. It was the complicated, frustrating, essential bonds of family. Bonds that could stretch across distance and disagreement without breaking. The company would survive in a new form. Her father would adapt to his changing health and role. Eric would face accountability and, perhaps, redemption. The family would continue, altered but intact. And Julia herself would carry forward a reconciled sense of identity. Still her own person, but also indelibly a Mitchell, with all the responsibility and richness that entailed. As she turned out the kitchen light and headed upstairs to her childhood bedroom, Julia felt something she hadn't experienced in this house for years: peace. Not because every problem was solved or every hurt healed, but because she had stopped running from the family that had shaped her, both its wounds and its wisdom. Tomorrow would bring more negotiations, more challenges, more family dynamics to navigate. But tonight, in this moment, coming home felt like moving forward rather than retreating into the past. And that, Julia decided as she climbed the familiar stairs, was progress worth building on.